The water of Keppel Harbour, Singapore, is a thick black oil under the new moon of September 1943. There are no lights in the city. The Japanese occupation has imposed a total blackout, a shroud of darkness over the former jewel of the British Empire. But the silence is a lie. Beneath the surface of the water, the pressure is changing. Time is running out, not in hours, but in the muffled mechanical ticks of acid fuses corroding metal. Men are dying in Asia by the thousands tonight, in Kempeitai torture cells, in forced labor camps in Burma, in humid jungles in New Guinea. But here, in this stagnant port, the fate of the war in the Pacific is about to suffer a violent, humiliating convulsion. And the tool for this convulsion is not a battleship, not a squadron of B-29 bombers, not a new secret weapon forged in the laboratories of Los Alamos. The weapon about to rip through the hulls of 30,000 tons of Imperial Japanese steel is a canoe, a flimsy structure of wood, canvas and rubber, ridiculed by the Allied admirals themselves, dismissed as a toy, nicknamed in the corridors of Melbourne as the clown canoe. If the Japanese knew what was floating silently under the noses of their destroyers, they would laugh. They would laugh right up until the moment the first magnetic limpet mine detonates, turning laughter into a scream of twisted steel and burnt flesh. This is the story of audacity born from absolute desperation. It is the story of how a group of ordinary men, dyed brown to hide in the shadows, sailed a rotten fishing bathtub straight into the dragon's throat, armed only with paddles and the certainty that they would not be coming home. To understand the suicidal madness of Operation Jaywick, we need to go back. We need to understand the smell of fear that saturated Australia in 1942. The world had turned upside down. The myth of the white man's invincibility, the impregnable fortress of Singapore, had collapsed in February 1942, surrendering to the Imperial Japanese Army in one of the most shameful defeats in British military history. 80,000 Allied soldiers marched into captivity. The barrier that protected Australia was gone. Japan wasn't just winning, they were devouring the map. Darwin was being bombed. Japanese midget submarines had entered Sydney Harbour. The fear was not abstract. It had the taste of ash in the mouth of every politician in Canberra and every mother in Brisbane. There was a palpable, almost physical sense that invasion was inevitable. And in the midst of this panic, this institutional paralysis, one man looked at the map not with fear, but with a cold, calculating fury. Major Ivan Lyon of the Gordon Highlanders. He was not the typical square-jawed British officer from the recruitment posters. Lyon was a man of long silences, with a mind that operated on frequencies others considered insane. He had escaped Singapore just before the fall, and he carried the stain of that defeat with him. But he also carried an idea. An idea that, when presented to the high commands of Allied intelligence, sounded like the delirium of a man who had spent too much time in the tropical sun. Lyon's plan defied all conventional military logic of the time. He proposed taking a captured Japanese fishing boat, a floating garbage can called the Kofuku Maru, filling it with commandos disguised as Asian fishermen, sailing 4,000 kilometers through the most heavily patrolled waters in the world, infiltrating the heart of Singapore Harbour, and blowing up the Japanese merchant fleet. And the final delivery method: folding kayaks, folboats, canvas structures stretched over wood that could be punctured by a piece of driftwood, let alone a machine gun bullet. When Lyon put the plan on the table, the initial reaction was not admiration. It was disbelief. The Admiralty looked at the canoe specifications and saw coffins. They looked at the proposed boat and saw a practice target for Japanese aviation. But 1942 was not a year for prudence. It was the year of do or die. The newly formed and ultra-secret Services Reconnaissance Department, SRD, operating under the innocuous name Z Special Unit, was desperate for anything that could wound Japanese pride and interrupt the flow of supplies. They needed a miracle, or at least a gesture violent enough to prove the war was not lost. Lyon was given the green light, not because they thought he would come back, but because the cost of losing 14 men and an old boat was statistically irrelevant compared to the propaganda potential of a success. Recruitment for Z Special Unit did not follow normal standards. They weren't looking for Olympic athletes or elite marksmen from a shooting range. They were looking for misfits, men who could fix a diesel engine with wire and chewing gum in the dark. Men who could sit in absolute silence for 10 hours straight without going insane. Men who, above all, had nothing to lose or had personal scores to settle with the Japanese Empire. From an initial group of hundreds of volunteers, attracted by vague notices about hazardous service, Lyon and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Donald Davidson of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, began to sift. Davidson was Lyon's opposite, rugged, practical, a man of physical action who understood the sea on a visceral level. Together they took the candidates to Refuge Bay, an isolated, mosquito-infested hole north of Sydney. Refuge Bay was not a training camp, it was a laboratory of human endurance. There were no barracks, no schedules, no comfort. There was only pain. The physical training was brutal, designed to break the spirit of any man who had the slightest doubt about the mission. But the physical part was the easiest. The real test was psychological. They introduced the canoes, the folboat. For the Australian soldiers, accustomed to the solidity of steel and firm ground, looking at these contraptions seemed like a bad joke. They were essentially plywood skeletons covered with a rubberized fabric skin. They were unstable, difficult to maneuver, and absurdly vulnerable. The idea of paddling one of them towards warships seemed suicidal. "Clown canoes," some recruits whispered at night, between hand-rolled cigarettes. But Lyon and Davidson did not tolerate cynicism. They knew the canoe's fragility was its only defense. Japanese radar, primitive at the time, would ignore wood and canvas. Sonar would not pick up the silent paddle. They were ghosts, and to become ghosts, the men had to merge with them. The night training began. Endless hours paddling in total darkness, learning to feel the water instead of seeing it, learning to breathe in unison so the sound of exhalation would not betray their position. They paddled until their hands bled, and then paddled more until calluses formed over the open wounds. They practiced the silent approach, gliding alongside a simulated ship's hull, attaching the heavy, clumsy, magnetic limpet mines and retreating without making a ripple in the water. Any sound, any tap of the paddle against the hull, meant immediate death in the exercises. Davidson was ruthless. One mistake meant starting over. The final group was carved out with a knife. 39 men passed the initial selection and expanded training of Z Unit. But only 14 would be chosen for the voyage on the Crate. 14 souls condemned to live, eat, and sleep in a space designed for dead fish. Among them were men like Corporal Andrew Happy Houston, a Scot as hard as granite, able seaman Arthur Jones, young and eager, and Lieutenant Hubert Cass, who would be the ship's captain, a man who looked at the Kofuku Maru with a mixture of professional horror and resignation. The boat itself was a character in this tragedy, renamed Crate. The name of a small, lethal and discreet Asian snake, the ship was a nautical disgrace. Just over 21 meters long, its wooden hull was soaked with oil and fish blood from years of previous use. The Gardner diesel engine, though reliable, was noisy and vibrated the deck maddeningly. The top speed was pathetic, 6.5 knots, maybe 7 if the current helped. They wouldn't be outrunning the Japanese, they would be crawling among them. The smell on board was indescribable, a mix of diesel, unwashed sweat, tropical mold, and the persistent stench of rotten fish that seemed to emanate from the planks themselves. Before departure, there was a final, grotesque and necessary detail: the camouflage. They could not look like white soldiers. They had to pass as local Malay or Indonesian fishermen, and so the dyeing process began. There was no Hollywood makeup here. They used a caustic solution of potassium permanganate and a brown dye called dye-o-la. They rubbed it into their skin day after day. The substance burned, dried the skin, caused constant itching. Blue and green eyes were a problem with no solution, except to keep them downcast or half-closed. They let their hair grow shaggy, stopped shaving, stopped washing their clothes. They had to smell like the boat. They had to become part of the olfactory landscape of occupied Asia. The transformation was unsettling. When they looked in the mirror, they saw strangers. Their Western identity was being erased, layer by layer, replaced by a mask necessary for survival. There was a cruel irony in it. men fighting for the British Empire and white Australia, having to darken their own skin for a chance to fight. The departure date arrived, September 2nd, 1943. The crate left from Exmouth Gulf in Western Australia. The port of Exmouth was desolate, hot, and full of flies, the last outpost of civilization before the void of the Indian Ocean. As they cast off, there were no bands playing, no inspiring speeches from generals. Just the monotonous drone of the Gardner engine and the worried looks of a few officers on shore who knew the statistical chances of return were close to zero. Naval intelligence gave them a 10% chance of success and perhaps a 5% chance of survival. Major Lyon stood on the bow, looking north. In his mind, the plan was perfect. In the minds of the men, the reality of confinement was beginning to set in. The living space on board was non-existent. 14 men, plus supplies for months, plus the dismantled canoes, plus weaponry, fuel and water. The heat in the lower deck was suffocating, often exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. Sleep was impossible. The boat's roll was nauseating. The crate did not cut through the waves. It rolled over them like a drunken cork. The first major test was not the Japanese, but the boat itself. Days after departure, the propeller shaft broke. In any other navy, this would be a distress call and a tow-home. For the crew of the crate, in the middle of hostile waters, it was a potential death sentence. They were adrift, a static target under the merciless sun. The ingenuity of the Z Special Unit mechanics was pushed to the limit. They had no suitable spare parts. They had to improvise, diving into shark-infested waters to work on the hull, hammering and cursing the metal until it obeyed. The repair, made with desperation and grease, held. The engine coughed back to life. That moment defined the mission. They were alone. Absolutely, terrifyingly alone. There would be no rescue. There would be no air support. If they sank, they would disappear from history without a trace. This awareness hardened the men. The nervous laughter about the clown canoes vanished. They realized that those fragile canoes were now their only hope for relevance, and paradoxically, their only ticket back. As they pushed north, towards the Lombok Strait, the tension on board changed texture. They went from being sailors fighting the sea to being prey entering the predator's territory. The Lombok Strait is one of the most important and dangerous sea corridors in the world, a vital artery for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Crossing it was like walking down the middle of a busy highway blindfolded. It was here that the flag went up, the flag of the rising sun. Flying the enemy's flag is an act of perfidy, a violation of the rules of war that guarantees summary execution if captured. But Lyon did not hesitate. To survive, they had to be Japanese. Seeing that red and white flag rise on the crate's mast caused a knot in the stomach of every Australian and Briton on board. It was the flag that had flown over the fall of Singapore, the flag under which their friends were being tortured. Now, it was the flag that protected them. The irony was acidic. They hated that piece of cloth, but they prayed it would work. The routine on board became a cycle of fear and boredom. The lookout scanned the horizon until his eyes burned, searching for the silhouette of a destroyer or the black dot of a patrol plane. Any visual contact meant the end. They had a Bren gun and a few Sten submachine guns hidden away, which was laughable against a warship. Their only defense was the disguise. If spotted, they were to wave, act like bored fishermen, maybe even show a fish. If boarded, the plan was simple and brutal. Scuttle the ship. The crate was fitted with demolition charges ready to be detonated. They would not be taken alive. The suicide pact was not written on paper, but it was etched in the glances exchanged between Lyon and Davidson. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew where the explosives were and how fast the fuse would burn. The passage through the Lombok Strait was a slow-motion nightmare. The currents there are violent, treacherous whirlpools that can spin a small boat like a top, and it was filled with enemy ships. On one particularly dark night, they found themselves dangerously close to a large Japanese transport ship. The enemy ship's lights swept the water. The crew of the crate froze on deck, their brown-dyed bodies blending with the dirty wood and fishing nets. The sound of the transport's engine drowned out the frantic beating of their own hearts. They could hear voices in Japanese drifting across the water. the smell of cigarettes from the enemy sailors. The distance was for shouting, not shooting. If a single beam of light had landed on them with more attention, if a Japanese officer had decided to inspect the filthy fishing boat rocking strangely in the current, the game would have ended right there. But the ship passed. The crate was too insignificant to be noticed. The arrogance of Japanese imperial might played in their favor. Who would be stupid enough to attack the empire in such a nutshell? They continued crawling north, entering the Java Sea. The heat increased, the drinking water began to taste of hot metal, and the psychological stress began to show cracks in the men's armor. Small arguments erupted over space, over food. Major Lyon maintained a steely, silent discipline. He knew the real test was still to come. They needed to find a forward base, a deserted island close enough to Singapore to launch the canoes, but far enough away not to be discovered. The map pointed to the Riau archipelago. Thousands of islets, mangroves and reefs. A labyrinth. Navigating it without detailed nautical charts was an invitation to disaster. Captain Kars spent entire nights poring over incomplete maps, trying to guess the depths, praying not to tear the bottom of the boat out on a coral reef. Every time the hull scraped against something submerged, the sound echoed like a gunshot inside the boat, paralyzing the crew. It was during this phase of the journey that the clownish nature of the mission began to transform into something solemn. The men obsessively cleaned and reassembled their weapons. They checked the limpet mines repeatedly. Davidson inspected the dismantled canoes, looking for any sign of mold or rot in the canvas. Those clown canoes were now their war horses. They began to feel a strange affection for them. They were fragile, yes, but they were the key to revenge. The target date was approaching. Singapore was just over the horizon. They could almost feel the city's gravity pulling them in. The old lion city, now a prison. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Singapore Harbour was fuller than intelligence had predicted. Oil tankers, cargo ships full of rubber and tin, troop transports. The target was rich. Too rich. Lion's temptation would be great. But the risk was proportional. Entering the harbour meant paddling for kilometres in waters patrolled by fast launches. It meant passing listening posts. It meant, essentially, walking into the lion's den and kicking the sleeping lion on the snout. On September 18th, the crate finally found its launch point, Panjang Island. It was little more than a piece of jungle thrown into the sea, but it offered cover. The atmosphere on board shifted from apprehension to a cold efficiency. It was time to disembark the attack team. The plan was to split the force. The crate, being too large and too risky to wait there, would retreat to the open sea, to deep and theoretically safer waters, and return only weeks later for the pickup. 6 men would go in the canoes. 3 canoes. 2 men per canoe. Lyon, Davidson, Page, Falls, Houston, Marsh. The elite of the elite, or the maddest of the mad. The moment of separation was silent. No cinematic hugs. Just firm handshakes, looks that said "don't die," and the transfer of supplies to the beach. As the crate turned its bow and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the 6 men alone on the beach with their dismantled canoes and tins of food, the real silence of war descended upon them. They had no radio to call for help. They had no doctor. They were thousands of kilometers from home, in the enemy's backyard, with 3 toy boats. The preparation on the island was methodical. Assembling the canoes required patience. Each piece of wood had to fit perfectly. A crack in the frame mid-operation would be fatal. They tested the weights, food, water, weapons, and most importantly, the mines. Each limpet mine weighed a considerable amount. The balance of the canoes was precarious. One sharp movement and they would capsize. During the day they hid in the dense bush, fighting ants, leeches, and the suffocating heat, watching the distant sea traffic. At night they reviewed the plan. The target was not random. They studied the silhouettes of the ships entering and leaving Singapore. They looked for the big ones, the tankers, the ships that, if they exploded, would put on the biggest fireworks show possible. Lyon wanted the explosion to be seen and heard by all the prisoners of war in Changi. He wanted them to know they had not been forgotten. This was the psychological mission, hope through destruction. But nature does not cooperate with special operations. The tides in the Singapore Strait are complex, changing direction with ferocity. Paddling against them in a loaded canoe is an exercise in muscular futility. They needed to time the attack with the tide. Davidson calculated the windows of opportunity. If they miscalculated, they would be swept out to the open sea or, worse, pushed against the searchlights of the Japanese docks. The weight on the island frayed the nerves. Every sound from the jungle seemed like a Japanese patrol. Every bird that took flight seemed like an alarm. Paranoia is the natural state of the infiltrated commando. They began to move from island to island hopping towards the harbor, establishing advanced hideouts. Donga's Island, Subar Island. Each night, Singapore grew larger on the horizon. The city lights, though obscured by the blackout, created a halo, an electrical presence in the sky. They could hear the distant hum of port machinery. They were so close they could smell the coal smoke from the ships. The night of the attack was set. September 26th. The conditions seemed ideal, or as ideal as they could be for a suicide mission. The men darkened their skin again, applying new layers of dye over their sunburns and insect bites. They put on black clothes. They checked their knives. There would be no shooting. The firing of a gun would be the end. Everything had to be done with blade and silence. The canoes were pushed into the water. The sound of the canvas hull brushing against the sand was the last sound of solid ground they would hear for many hours. As they entered the water, the sense of vulnerability was absolute. They were sitting below the waterline, invisible, insignificant, 3 splinters of wood floating towards a fortress of steel. As they paddled towards the harbor, the world narrowed to the rhythm of the paddles. Left, right, controlled breathing. The silhouette of Singapore grew, a black mass blocking the stars. They began to see the shapes of the anchored ships. They were gigantic, walls of steel that rose dozens of meters above them. The sound of water slapping against the metal hulls was frighteningly loud. They were entering the kill zone. Searchlights swept the sky sporadically, but the Japanese operators didn't look down at the black water. They looked for bombers, not canoes. The enemy's arrogance was the Australians' shield. The clown canoe was about to enter the main stage, and the audience had no idea the show had begun. Major Lyon in the lead canoe raised his hand, the signal to stop. They were in the middle of the harbor. All around them, targets, tankers, freighters. The feast was served. Each man's heart beat against his ribs like a hammer. The fear was there, cold and viscous, but it was pushed down by brutal training and a frozen determination. It was time to work. It was time to make the Japanese pay for the year 1942. The silence inside Keppel Harbor is not empty. It is heavy, pressurized, a physical weight pressing against the eardrums of the 6 men. They are no longer soldiers, they are water rats, navigating a sewer of industrial waste and salt water. The canoes, sitting mere inches above the surface, feel obscenely fragile as they glide into the shadows cast by the enemy fleet. To the left and right, the hulls of Japanese freighters rise like cliff faces of rusted iron, blocking out the moon, blocking out the sky. The scale is terrifying. From the waterline, a 10,000-ton tanker looks like a mountain range of riveted steel. The sounds of the ships are amplified here. The deep rhythmic thrumming of generators, the flushing of bilge water, the clatter of boots on metal decks 50 feet above. Every sound is a potential death knell. Major Lyon and able seaman Houston in the lead canoe stop paddling. They drift. Breathing is a conscious effort. They are now deep inside the enemy's digestive tract. If a searchlight hits them now, there is no cover. There is no running. There is only the dark water and the inevitable hail of machine gun fire. But the lights continue to sweep the clouds, ignoring the darkness below. Lyon signals. Target acquisition. They are not just looking for any ship, they are looking for the juggernauts. The modern tankers carrying the oil that fuels the Zero fighters and the battleships of the combined fleet. They spot one. The Hakusan Maru. It is a beast, laden heavy, sitting low in the water, perfect. The approach must be agonizingly slow. A splash is a siren. The paddle blades slice the oily water without breaking the surface tension. They pull themselves alongside the black wall of the ship. The smell is overpowering, crude oil, rotting seaweed, and the metallic tang of the ship's skin. Now comes the technical nightmare. Attaching a limpet mine is not a smooth cinematic gesture. It is a clumsy, knuckle-busting struggle in the dark. The hull is slimy with algae and encrusted with barnacles sharp enough to slice through wet skin like razors. Houston holds the canoe steady, his muscles trembling with the isometric tension of keeping the frail craft from banging against the steel. A single thud of wood against metal could alert the sentries pacing above. Lion reaches out. He has to scrape the hull clean. The sound of his knife chipping away the barnacles sounds like a construction site in his own head, but the hum of the ship's engines masks it. He takes the limpet mine, a heavy chunk of explosives with magnetic clamps. He leans over the gunwale. The canoe tips precariously. He places the mine below the waterline. Click. The magnets seize the steel. The sound of the connection travels through the canoe's frame, a mechanical heartbeat that signals the beginning of the end for this ship. He activates the fuse. Acid begins to eat through the retaining wire. There is no countdown clock, just chemistry doing its work. 3 limpets on this ship, 3 death sentences clamped to its belly. They push off, gently, pushing against the very thing they just condemned to die. The psychological dissonance is staggering. They are intimately touching the enemy, leaving a gift and then drifting away like lovers in the night. Meanwhile, a few hundred meters away, Lieutenant Davidson and Able Seaman Falls are hunting in the roads off Bucum Island. Their target is even more ambitious, the Kizan Maru. But the current is fighting them. The tide in Singapore harbor is a living, malevolent force. It grabs the small canoe and tries to spin it, tries to smash it against the anchor chains. Davidson fights the water with brute strength masked as finesse. They reach the Kizan. Same procedure. Scrape. Place. Click. Arm. But then, a complication. A Japanese launch, a patrol boat, revs its engines nearby. Its wake hits them. The canoe pitches violently. Water slops over the side. Falls freezes, his hand gripping the gunwale, his face pressed against the wet canvas. The patrol boat passes within 30 yards. They can see the silhouette of the gunner in the stern smoking a cigarette. The cherry of the burning tobacco is the brightest thing in the universe. The soldier looks out, directly at the patch of shadow where the Australians are hiding. He stares for a second, 2 seconds, an eternity. Then he flicks the cigarette butt into the water. It hisses as it hits the surface, feet from the canoe. The boat moves on. Davidson lets out a breath he didn't know he was holding. They are ghosts. They are invisible. Or the devil is looking out for them tonight. The third canoe, Page and Jones, works the eastern sector. They find the Nasusan Maru. They plant their mines with the efficiency of factory workers on a night shift, but the physical toll is mounting. Their arms are burning with lactic acid. They have been paddling for hours, fueled only by benzodrine and fear. Dehydration is setting in. The heat, even at night, is a wet blanket wrapped around their faces, and now the clock is the enemy. The tide is turning. The sun is chasing them. They have placed the mines. The harbor is seeded. Now they have to get out. Escaping is harder than entering. The element of surprise is gone in their minds. They feel exposed, as if the mines are already exploding. They have to paddle back against the changing tide, back to Dongus Island, before the sun rises and reveals 3 specks of wood struggling in the open water. The retreat is a blur of agony. The romance of the raid evaporates, replaced by the rhythmic suffering of the stroke. Pull, recover, pull, recover. Their hands are raw meat. Their backs are spasms of pain. They are racing the dawn. As the sky begins to turn a bruised purple in the east, they reach the cover of the mangroves on Dongas. They drag the canoes into the dense foliage, collapsing into the mud. They don't speak. They can't. They just lie there, chests heaving, covered in camouflage dye and sweat, waiting for the sound. The fuses are timed for the morning. They need the ships to sink in daylight to maximize the chaos, to ensure the Japanese see the destruction. 05:15 a.m., September 27th, 1943. The first explosion tears through the silence of Singapore like a thunderclap from hell. It is not a dull thud. It is a violent metallic crack that echoes off the hills. From their hiding spot on Dongas, the Commandos snap their heads up. They can't see the ship directly, but they see the result. a column of black smoke and water geysers into the sky. Then seconds later, another, and another. The timing is imperfect, staggered, which makes it worse for the Japanese. It's not one accident, it's a barrage. Inside the harbor, chaos reigns. The Kizan Maru shudders as a hole the size of a truck is punched through its engine room plates. The ocean rushes in with the force of a hydraulic press. Men asleep in the lower decks are crushed or drowned in oil and darkness before they can even scream. Sirens begin to wail across the city, air raid sirens. The Japanese commanders look to the sky, searching for bombers that aren't there. Their anti-aircraft guns swivel frantically, tracing empty clouds. They cannot conceive, cannot imagine that the attack came from the water. Then the Hakusan Maru goes. The explosion breaks its keel. The massive ship groans, a sound like a dying whale, steel twisting and shearing under impossible stress. It begins to list, cargo shifting, cranes swinging wildly. On the docks, panic. Japanese trucks screech to halts. Troops pour out, bayonets fixed, running towards the wharves, screaming orders that no one can hear over the din of sinking ships. The harbor water is churning, bubbling with escaping air and oil. 7 ships, nearly 40,000 tons of shipping are being gutted. The Yamagiri Maru settles into the mud, its superstructure still visible, a burning monument to the raid. The fires start. Oil slicks ignite. The black water turns orange. For the men hiding in the mangroves, the sound is music. It is the validation of every blister, every moment of terror, every drop of sweat. They are laughing. Not loud, hysterical laughter, but a grim, silent shaking of the shoulders. They did it. The clown canoes just crippled a fleet. But the laughter dies quickly. The realization hits them. They have kicked the hornet's nest, and now they are trapped inside the hive. The Japanese confusion will not last. Soon the shock will turn to rage, and that rage will be directed at anything that moves on the water. The search for the saboteurs will be apocalyptic. In Singapore City, the Kempe Tai, the dreaded secret police, are already moving. They don't blame commandos, not yet. It's too impossible. They blame local insurgents. They blame spies. The roundup begins within the hour. Innocent civilians are pulled from their beds, beaten in the streets, accused of sabotage. The commandos can hear the distant commotion, the shift in the atmosphere from sleep to violence. They know they have to move. They have to vanish. The crate is waiting at the rendezvous point, Pompong Island, hundreds of miles away. Between them and salvation lies an ocean that is about to swarm with angry patrol boats and reconnaissance aircraft. They push the canoes back into the water. The adrenaline of the attack is gone, replaced by the cold dread of the escape. They are no longer hunters. They are the most wanted prey in Southeast Asia. The journey back to the rendezvous is a study in paranoia. Every fishing boat on the horizon looks like a destroyer. Every cloud looks like a zero. They paddle only at night, hiding in sweltering, mosquito-choked mangroves during the day. Their food supplies are rotting. Their water is warm and tastes of iodine. Their bodies are breaking down. Tropical ulcers begin to form on their legs, open sores that refuse to heal, eating into the flesh. But they keep paddling. They have to reach Pompong by the night of October 1st. If they miss the crate, the ship will leave. That is the order. Lion gave it himself. Do not endanger the ship for stragglers. October 1st arrives. They reach Pompong. The island is dark, empty. There is no crate. Panic, cold and sharp, pierces through the exhaustion. Did the ship sink? Did they get the date wrong? Did Cars leave early? They pull the canoes onto the beach, their legs buckling under them as they try to walk on solid ground for the first time in days. They scan the dark horizon. Nothing, just the indifferent stars and the sound of waves lapping against the sand. They are stranded. The victory in Singapore suddenly tastes like ashes. They have pulled off the greatest sabotage raid of the war, and their reward is to die of starvation on a rock in the middle of nowhere. Davidson looks at Lion. There is no accusation, just a shared, hollow look of acceptance. They prepare to wait, to ration the last of the chocolate, to die. But then, a sound. A low rhythmic thumping, distinctive, ugly, beautiful. The Gardner diesel engine, A shadow detaches itself from the darkness of the sea. The crate. It arrives late, delayed by patrols, creeping in like a guilty thief. The signal light flashes. The Commandos signal back. The relief is so intense it causes physical nausea. They paddle out to the ship. Hands reach down from the gunwale. Hands that smell of diesel and fish. The best smell in the world. They are hauled aboard, limp ragdolls of men. The canoes, their faithful broken vessels, are scuttled, smashed and sunk. They cannot be taken back. No evidence can remain. As the wood fractures and the canvas tears, it feels like killing a friend. The crate turns south. The escape is not over. They still have to cross the Lombok Strait again. And this time the Japanese are awake. The element of surprise is gone completely. The Navy is hunting. The crate is no longer just a fishing boat. It is a needle in a haystack, and the Japanese are burning the haystack down to find it. The tension on the return voyage makes the journey out seem like a holiday. They run into a Japanese destroyer escort at night in the Lombok Strait. The warship looms out of the darkness, passing so close that the wake rocks the crate violently. The crew stands at the rail, dressed in sarongs, hearts hammering against their ribs, waiting for the searchlight, waiting for the tracer fire. The destroyer pauses. It seems to sniff the air. Then, miraculously, it accelerates and disappears into the gloom. They have used up a lifetime of luck in a single month. On October 19th, 1943, the crate limps back into Exmouth Gulf. They have been gone for 48 days. They look like skeletons. Their skin is stained with dye and dirt, their eyes sunken, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition and salt sores. But they are alive. They bring back no prisoners, no captured flags, just a logbook and the knowledge that they did the impossible. They blew up 39,000 tons of shipping with 3 canoes. The raid is hailed as a masterstroke of special operations, a triumph. But in the debriefing rooms, as the adrenaline fades, the darkness returns. The success of Jaywick has a cost that none of them foresaw, a cost that will not be paid by them but by the people of Singapore. The Japanese, humiliated and furious, unable to believe that white men could penetrate their harbour, turn their wrath on the local population. The Double Tenth massacre begins. Torture, executions. The innocent pay the blood price for the Commandos' glory. This is the bitter iron pill that Lyon and his men have to swallow. In war, there is no clean victory. Every blow you strike rebounds on someone else. The clown canoes worked. The mission was a success. But as the men of Z Special Unit try to sleep in clean sheets for the first time in months, the nightmares are just beginning. And for Major Lyon, the success is not enough. It is a drug. He is already looking at the map again. He is already thinking about going back. And that thought is the seed of his doom. Success is a dangerous drug. For Major Ivan Lyon, the triumph of Operation Jaywick was not a satisfying conclusion. It was an itch that refused to go away. Back in Australia, while politicians toasted the heroes of the crate, Lyon was already pacing the floors of the SRD headquarters, staring at the map of Singapore. He was haunted, not by the ships he sank, but by the ones he missed. He felt the weight of the Double Tenth massacre, the torture of civilians he had inadvertently triggered. But his reaction was not to pull back. It was to double down, to hit them again, harder, to prove that the first time wasn't luck. This is the tragic flaw of the warrior monk. He cannot leave the battlefield. He proposed a new mission, bigger, louder, Operation Rimau, the Tiger. If Jaywick was a surgical scalpel wielded in the dark, Rimau was intended to be a sledgehammer swung in broad daylight. But history has a cruel way of punishing those who try to repeat a miracle. The year is 1944. The war has changed. The Allies are pushing back, but the Japanese are digging in, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Lyon's new plan reflects this escalation. No more clown canoes. No more paddling until hands bleed. He wants technology. He wants speed. He secures a new toy from the British Experimental Weapons Division, the Motorized Submersible Canoe, MSC, nicknamed the Sleeping Beauty. It is a sleek metal cigar, a one-man mini-submarine that can travel underwater or skim the surface, powered by electric batteries. On paper, it is the ultimate infiltration vehicle. In reality, it is a temperamental, claustrophobic coffin filled with unproven electronics. The simplicity of the wood and canvas folboat is replaced by the complexity of valves, trim tanks, and batteries that leak acid. But Lion is enamored with the potential. He recruits a new team, 23 men. The core veterans of Jaywick, Davidson, Page, Falls, Houston, Marsh, sign up immediately. It is a testament to Lion's charisma, or perhaps a shared death wish, that men who had already survived the impossible volunteered to go back into the fire. They knew the odds. They knew the Japanese would be waiting this time. And yet they packed their bags. This time there is no rusty fishing boat for the long journey. The delivery system is the Royal Navy submarine HMS Porpoise. September 1944. The Commandos pile into the steel belly of the sub along with their sleeping beauties. The journey is a nightmare of humidity and foul air. The submarine is packed to bursting. The Commandos sleep on top of torpedoes in gangways, sweating in the recycled air, checking and rechecking their equipment. The mood is different from the crate. There is less joking. There is a professional heaviness. They are carrying silenced Sten guns, limpet mines and cyanide pills. The suicide pill, the L tablet, is standard issue now. Everyone knows what capture means. The Kempeitai does not take prisoners of war. They take subjects for biological experiments and bayonet practice. The plan is audacious to the point of madness. The Porpoise will drop them off near Marapas Island, an uninhabited speck in the Riau archipelago. They will establish a base, capture a local junk to use as a mothership, tow the Sleeping Beauties closer to Singapore, and then launch a massive attack, sinking not 7 but 60 ships. They want to decapitate the entire port. On September 23rd, the Porpoise surfaces off Marapas. The Commandos disembark. The transfer is chaotic, wrestling the heavy submersible canoes through the hatches and into the water. They set up camp on the island. The submarine departs, promising to return in a month. They are alone again. But this time, the isolation feels different. The silence of the island feels hostile. The first phase goes according to plan. They intercept and capture a local Malay junk, the Mustika. It's a perfect Trojan horse. They load the Sleeping Beauties into the hold, covering them with rotting coconuts and sarongs. The commando team, again dyed brown and dressed in rags, takes control of the vessel. Lion is the master of the junk. They set sail for Singapore. The tension is excruciating. They are sailing a slow, clumsy wooden boat through waters that are now patrolling with a paranoid intensity. The Japanese have learned. They check papers. They board vessels. The ghost trick of Jaywick will not work as easily a second time. October 10th, 1944. The anniversary of the double 10th. A bad omen. They are nearing the target area, off the coast of Batam. The city lights of Singapore are visible, taunting them. And then disaster strikes. It doesn't come in the form of a destroyer or a Zero fighter. It comes in the form of bad luck and a vigilant local water police patrol. A police launch approaches the Mustika. It's a routine check. Nothing special. But something feels wrong. Maybe the Mustika is sitting too low in the water. Maybe the crew doesn't look quite right. The police boat pulls alongside. A Malay official shouts questions. Lion tries to bluff. He speaks the language. He waves papers. But the official isn't buying it. He insists on boarding. He insists on seeing the cargo. This is the hinge upon which 23 lives turn. If Lion allows them to board, they will find the Sleeping Beauties. If he refuses, they will open fire. The element of surprise, the absolute cornerstone of the mission, evaporates in a split second. Lion makes the only choice he can. He draws his weapon. The silence of the afternoon is shattered by the crack, crack, crack of a silenced Sten gun. The police crew are killed or fall overboard, but the damage is catastrophic. The noise, the commotion, it has been witnessed. Another boat is escaping in the distance. The alarm is raised. The raid is blown before it even begins. The reaction on the Mustika is frantic. The mission to sink the ships in Singapore is dead. Now the mission is survival. They are sitting ducks in a slow junk, minutes away from being swarmed by the Japanese Navy. Lion orders the Sleeping Beauties, the high-tech wonders that were supposed to win the war, to be scuttled. They open the seacocks. The expensive machines sink to the bottom of the ocean, Useless metal. Then they rig the mustika with explosives. They have to destroy the evidence. The Commandos transfer to their emergency escape craft, folboats. The clown canoes are back. The irony is bitter enough to choke on. They came with spaceships. They are leaving in rowboats. The mustika blows up, a fireball marking their location for every Japanese lookout within 20 miles. The 23 men paddle furiously for the nearest islands. The group fragments. Lion knows that 23 men moving together is a target. Small groups might slip through. He divides the Commandos, 4 groups. The order is simple. Make for Meripus. Wait for the sub. If the sub doesn't come, try to island hop back to Australia. It is a death sentence masked as a plan. Australia is 4,000 kilometers away. The Japanese reaction is swift and terrifying. This is not 1943. They are not confused. They know exactly what is happening. Enemy commandos are in the Riau archipelago. They flood the area. Soldiers, airplanes, patrol boats. The hunt is on. It is a fox hunt, and the commandos are the foxes. The ensuing days are a blur of skirmishes and desperate movement. Lion, leading a small group, lands on Sore Island to rest. They are exhausted, dehydrated, their morale shattered. But the Japanese are relentless. A patrol tracks them down. The Battle of Sore Island is not a battle. It is a last stand. Lion and his men, armed only with submachine guns and grenades, are pinned down on a beach by a superior force with heavy machine guns and mortars. There is no cover, just sand and scrub. Lion fights with a cold, terrifying calm. He positions his men, returning fire, holding back the inevitable. He is fighting not for victory, but for time for the other groups to get further away. A Japanese grenade lands near him. Shrapnel tears into his body. He keeps firing. Another bullet hits him. Ivan Lion, the mastermind, the Shadow King of Singapore, dies on a dirty patch of sand, his blood soaking into the foreign soil he was so obsessed with. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Davidson, the man who had followed him to hell and back twice, is wounded alongside him. Seeing Lion fall, seeing the Japanese closing in with bayonets fixed, Davidson checks his ammo. Empty. He looks at Corporal Campbell, also wounded. They share a look. They know the stories of Japanese captivity. Davidson reaches for the cyanide pill he bites down. It is quick. The foam gathers at his lips before his heart stops. He chooses his own end rather than give the enemy the satisfaction. With Lion and Davidson dead, the heart of the unit stops beating, but the body is still twitching. The remaining commandos are scattered across the archipelago, hiding in caves, burying themselves in sand, drinking brackish water. They are being hunted like animals. The Japanese use local trackers. They burn foliage. They sweep the islands systematically. One by one, the groups are intercepted. Some die fighting, like Lion. Ross and Wallace are cornered on a small islet. They fight until their ammunition clicks dry. When the Japanese rush them, they do not surrender. They use their knives. They are gunned down at point-blank range. Others are not so lucky. They are captured. Starving, delirious with fever, betrayed by locals who fear Japanese reprisal, they are rounded up. They are beaten, stripped, and thrown into the holds of transport ships bound for Singapore. They are no longer soldiers. They are captured spies. The Geneva Convention does not apply to them. They are heading to Outram Road Jail, a place where the entrance is a gate, but the exit is usually a chimney. The tragedy of Riau is not just the failure of the mission. It is the dismantling of a brotherhood. These men who trained together, suffered together, and believed in their invincibility are picked off one by one in the tropical sun. The sleeping beauties lie rusting at the bottom of the sea, a monument to technological hubris. The folboats drift empty in the currents. The radio silence back in Australia is deafening. The Porpoise returns to Meripus at the appointed time. It waits on the surface, its crew scanning the beach with binoculars, looking for a signal fire, a flashlight, anything. They see nothing, just the jungle and the indifference of the ocean. The captain waits as long as he dares, risking his own ship. Finally, he gives the order to dive. The submarine slips away. The door slams shut. The survivors of Riau are truly alone now, trapped in a nightmare that has only just begun. The raid is over. The martyrdom is about to start.